Hi, Misha here, and I guess AK Week continues. This is a gun you saw me pick up a couple of years ago, one I had wanted for a good long while. And we have fired it on camera before. 56 too. This is a Type 56S2, manufactured in China and imported by B West, chambered for 7.62 by 39. Now we're going to come back to this, but in this video I thought we would kind of look at the Preban era Chinese imports, which began in 1983 and ended abruptly March 8, 1989. So, roughly under 6 years. But in those 6 years, multiple factories assembled, and mainly through Norinco and Polytech as export firms, sent over and were imported by dozens of American companies, hundreds of thousands of AKs. In fact, including the so-called post-ban era guns, so 1990 through 94, China estimates they sent about 1 million AK Kalashnikov Type 56 type guns to the USA. So, yeah, we'll come back to this one, but let's go to the very first Chinese AK ever imported, and really only the second semi-auto true AK in the USA. Now, yes, you could argue that the Bayonet or even the IMI Galil were AKs, and certainly they are inspired by them, but parts interchangeability is nil. Now, the first true AKM type was the Steyr Mahdi out of Egypt. That was around 1982. Going back to 1980, a few things happened. China, who had been experiencing better relations with the West and U.S. specifically, was granted most favored nation status by the USA. And Norinco was set up to export goods, services, what have you, out of China. Fast forward to September of 1982, and this company was established, Clayco Sports. And in the summer of 1983, they brought over their first samples of this gun, known as the AKS for AK Sporter. This was approved by the ATF, and essentially one big batch was brought over, and these are being advertised quite heavily by 1984. And there's a few things that kind of distinguish the Clayco guns. The synthetic furniture, so-called Bakelite, although it's really not. And this could either be in red-brown or black, like here, with a bit of a green under hue. It does have a storage compartment in the stock, slab side handguards, 1.5mm stamped receiver, blued finish, feeds from standard flat back mags, and had a few different pistol grip styles. This one has kind of the more straight style, the 1919 style. And it did have an AKM, or Type 2 bayonet lug, and then it had 14mm threaded barrel, typically with a standard compensator. Like I said, 16.25-inch barrel, chrome lined, cold hammer forged, and it is of the heavier AK47 profile with the ported gas tube and smooth top cover. So these came in, and the truth is, they kind of flopped, if I'm being honest. No one really knows why. It could just be that 7.62 by 39 was not common in the USA in 1983, 84, 85. It could be that they have the big warning on the side of the dust cover. That might seem a little today, but truth be told, when semi-automatic versions were coming in of all kinds of guns, for example the IMI Uzi Model A, this was a very common feature in the late 70s and early 80s. Many blame the synthetic furniture, which some felt made it look cheap, and claimed that Americans wanted wood furniture, kind of, Vietnam era styling. Either way, honestly, Clayco failed. They brought over one big batch, maybe a couple of smaller ones. They filed for bankruptcy. They dissolved in 1987. Yeah. Flipping it over to show you, bolt carrier in the white. And here it is with its unique Type 2 or AKM bayonet. Note that there's not a wire cutter on the scabbard or notch in the blade, or that the blade is not serrated. And they did these in all kinds of configurations. Sometimes they would match the furniture, sometimes not. And these, of course, would mount on the lug under the gas block. And this was based on the newer pattern of Type 56, which we'll talk about. Clayco also imported the underfolding variant, and those tended to have bolt carriers that were blued, not left in the white. So there are basically two versions brought over by Clayco. And these are all kind of based on the newer pattern introduced for select fire users in 1980. But before we talk about that, let's kind of go back in time and also move forward with our imports. Around late 1984, or definitely by 1985, guns that seemed more targeted towards the American market began to appear. Woodstalkers. These were really what Americans were jonesing for because they look like guns that had been seen in Vietnam. They look like standard Type 56s. Down below we have my Spiker. This is an early KFS Polytech import, still under the AKS name. And up here we have an interesting gun that is a IAC or IACO, Interstate Arms Corporation import. And this is the newer name of 56S. The 56S name started to replace the AKS name around 1986. And these are very similar, except this one has the AKM type lug, and this one, of course, has the 56 unique spiker. Otherwise, very much the same stamped receivers. Now, the Chinese AK, going back to 1956, along with the RPD and the SKS, China acquired a license to produce these. Now, the SKS was adopted as the Type 56 carbine. The AK, which was the Type 3 mill gun, was adopted as the Type 56 submachine gun, later reclassified for the new definition of assault rifle in China. And the RPD would be the Type 56 light machine gun, for what it's worth. The original guns were very, very similar to Russian, but one of the earliest changes that was to be introduced came around 1960 when they went to this enclosed front sight base with complete ears, very VZ-58 style. Another unique feature would come around 1965, 1966, this unique spike bayonet. Before that, they took a standard Type 1 AK47 bayonet. And then a short time later, our stamped receiver would appear. And this is a unique pattern of stamped receiver. Between 1967 and 1970, the Chinese factories would switch over. Now, AK production was originally started at Factory 66. However, it would also carry on to Factory 386, Factory 416, Factory 56, and some sources even claim Factory 26, although that could just be SKS's. But it would spread out, and each factory would kind of do their own thing just a little bit. Now, the reason the Type 56 has a lot of AK47 features, they never had the blueprints, the drawings, nor the licensing to produce the AKM, which Russia would introduce in 1959, because by the 1960s, relations between Russia and China were not good. There was a brief thaw, but overall not good. So they did it their own. So basically they took the original AK front end and plugged it into a new type of receiver. This is why it's 1.5 millimeters thick, which kind of emulates the milled receiver. Dimples, a very unique rivet pattern, front and back, compared to an AKM. And also, of course, they had switched from screwing in the barrel to press and pinning, which has a lot of advantages for mass production. And they would keep on using a blued finish. They would also go to their unique flat back pattern of magazine, which some find more comfortable to grip, but having the spine in the back, it's also cheaper to manufacture. And, you know, they would keep producing these first for the Chinese military, but then they would start exporting them in huge quantities. North Vietnam being a huge reciprocant. The Afghan Mujahideen would actually get some in the 1980s. Both Iran and Iraq would use them in the 1980s against each other. On and on and on. We could go a whole video talking about that. But I just wanted to give some context for what we're talking about. And like I said, these are the types of guns that seem to sell much better in America and that Americans were kind of wanting. Flipping these over. This is really when the importers started to open up. KFS would begin bringing in guns, soon famous for their Polytechs. B West would be another early importer. And you would start to have other companies, like I said, IAC here, CSI, even Dominion Investment Group, famous for bringing in some of the early arsenals, would be part of it. There's a whole list out there. Some would all bring in one small batch, some would bring in huge batches, and there'd be variations, some requested by the importers, and some just depending on which factory. For example, Factory 386 and Factory 416 did things a little differently. You can actually see it on this gun. Based on the way the rear trunnion is, it's very smooth here. And on this one, the IAC, the 56 marked one, it's more dished in, more AKM pattern, whereas the KFS import here kind of reminds me more of an AK47 look, although they're still the same type of pattern, interchangeable. This one also has an extended paddle mag release compared to this one. That's something that KFS Polytechs were known for, and they were also known for having spring-loaded firing pins, whereas others would sometimes have free floating. And again, this one has the spike bayonet, and this one has the AKM type. This one has the slant brake, and for whatever reason, a lot of your Polytech guns had the muzzle nut on them. And wood coloration could vary wildly too, from dark brown to blonde to even a reddish color. It just kind of depended. Even the quality of bluing, the level of metal polishing could vary quite a bit. So, there you go. Well, I've been talking about KFS and Polytech, so if I don't bring this one up now, people have already started to run to the comments. The AK47S, AK47 Sporter, better known by its nickname, the Polytech Legend. Now, this is often credited with being an exact copy of a Russian Type 3, an AK-47 Type 3, circa, 1955, let's say. Broad strokes, true. In the details, no. And I've covered that in detail in past videos. But I've got to talk about it. If I'm going to talk about all of the Chinese guns, I've got to talk about the Legend, especially since I have one here to show you. And this really was a nice gun. And they were about 450 bucks when Polytech, when KFS, King's Firearms introduced these. And they were only brought over from 1987 through 1989, or rather they were made in 1988 and the last batch came in 89. So not a long period, really. But because of their relatively low price and unique looks, they sold exceptionally well. So yeah, what makes the Legend different and similar to other models? For that, let's bring out our standard 56S again. Okay, first big difference. This is on a 1.5 stamped receiver with Chinese front trunnion. The Legend, of course, is on a milled receiver, so no trunnion, it's all one unit. And this is a true machined receiver. This isn't kind of any of that weird cast and then machined stuff. So that's good. It also has the rear sling swivel in the correct right spot, because early guns did not have it on the stock like this. It was on the receiver. So good stuff right there. Now, one thing to point out, the barrel was pressed and pinned in. Original Type 56s, just like AK Type 3s, it would have not been pinned in, it would have been screwed in. Another thing to talk about on the receiver, the trigger guard is only held in with 3 rivets, one on each side plus one in the back, just as on a modern 56. Okay. And this has the stamped style of mag catch versus the machine style originally used, either in Russia, China, or elsewhere. So those are things to kind of keep in mind. The barrel ends of these two are very similar because of how China did the 56. Handguard here, handguard here. Same type of 16-inch heavier profile barrel with ported gas tube on both. But you'll notice this has the Type 1 bayonet lug with muzzle nut, 14 mil threads. And it has the open-eared front sight base. So that's good. Whereas this has the later closed style and the AKM lug here. However, there's a couple of things to point out. For one, even though this is the correct open ear pattern, this is a cast front sight base. Very common, nothing wrong with casting, but all of your original 50s guns would have been a machined part. There's also a bit of an issue with the handguards. Whereas the lower handguard is correct, slab side with the metal tang, the upper handguard is not vented. So, not exactly correct. Now the rear sights, well, they're calibrated to 800 meters, and they even did their best to kind of give faux Russian markings. And the pistol grip is your larger patterned checkered style versus your smooth style. To be fair, Russian AKs, milled or whatever, would have smoother stamped, a smoother pattern either way. And the buttstock is quite correct too, with storage compartment. And these, of course, would ship with flatback magazines, typically 3 of them in the box. Flipping these over, one thing I wanted to point out, the 56S has the extended shelf style safety selector, and the Legend does not. It has the shorter style. In fact, this is a unique selector if we're going to be devils in the details for the Legend. Lightning cuts are quite nice. Now, one internal difference, this uses the modern 56 or even AKM pattern recoil spring, which is a bent piece of wire kind of in a U shape. The original guns had a machined tube. Now, all of these Chinese guns used the traditional double hook pattern of trigger, whereas the AKM had the single hook. But remember, China was not operating off the AKM blueprints. They were still modifying the original AK Type 3. So this is the Legend. It is a very good gun and a very well made gun, but this was built in the 1980s, 2 decades after the machined receiver Type 56S was taken out of production. This was a replica that China made to replicate the Russian gun. That's why the devil's not quite right in the details. Think of it as those Chinese Winchester 97 trench gun copies they make. Very good, very authentic, but not quite like an original Winchester, and made with newer techniques, just as the Legend is here. Again, the cast front sight base and the 3 versus 5 rivet trigger guard are kind of easy things to ID. So since I had another Legend to show you, that we would. I'm not dogging on them, I'm just trying to be real about them. So let's go from the kind of the old school style to the newest pattern of Chinese gun. 56-2. That's right, we're back to these, the Clayco and the B West folder. Now these are actually kind of a pair, and were meant to be the second or maybe third generation of Type 56, depending on how you, kind of want to identify them. In the late 1960s, it was known that they needed to update, especially with the furniture, going away from wood to something new. After all, Russia had introduced the Bakelite type magazine and furniture, even AG4, but we call them Bakelite, in 1968. And wood wasn't the best in places like Vietnam. So work would begin, but because of the political and cultural situation in China, it would stall out. Finally, in 1980, the Type 56-2 was introduced. And this was designed for the Army, but by the time it was ready to go, the Type 81 was basically ready to go too. So it saw very, very limited use within the PLA. Maybe the Navy had some, mainly though it was sold to Chinese police, militia, and it was actually a popular export. And that's what this represents up here, the 56-2. It's why I wanted one. This was the first version to really go away from the spike bayonet, and these could either be made with the Type 1 style or the Type 2 style. They had a new pattern of synthetic handguard, again either black or red, and there would be these 2 styles of pistol grip. It's kind of based on the factory and the molds. This one has what I think of as the VZ58 kind of curvy back pattern, and this one has the straighter pattern. And that's typically what you see, the more straight for the fixed stock and the more curvy for the folder. But the butt stock is the big kind of improvement. It has a whole new folding mechanism. It has the cleaning kit compartment in here that's well secure. You need a bullet tip to pop it out. It's metal otherwise. And yeah, it was just an updated version of a folding stock, kind of like the Russian AKS 74 folder. Totally different mechanism, but same basic idea. That was the 2. Now the fixed stock variant, which wasn't the main line, but they made them, was known as the 56-3. There was even an underfolding version with the synthetic furniture and the newer style bayonet lugs, known as the 56-4. So this was a whole new family. And like I said, these were very popular exports. For example, Sri Lanka purchased quite a few 56-2 select fire guns, as did Finland. In fact, a special version was made for Finland, known to have a stronger hammer spring to work with the Lapua ammunition that Finland used. And these were adopted as the RK56TP. And over 100,000 were purchased. In fact, they're still technically in service today. And on top of that, a lot of the fixed stock versions were popular exports to Africa and the Middle East because they were more durable furniture and they were quite cheap, frankly. And I think, like I said earlier, some people say that these didn't sell well when Clayco did them because, well, they wanted wood. I think the reason China sent these over was just that was kind of what was in production in 1983-84, because that was their new AK model, 56 model. Who knows? While Clayco never imported any of these cool side folders, other companies did. Like I said, this is a B West, and a lot of people are skittish around B West, and for good reason. They got a bit of a negative reputation because of the US-made receiver guns that B West did in the 90s using Chinese kits. This was after the ban. But since B West was one of the earlier importers, like I said, either late 84 or early 85, they brought over some of the larger numbers. And in several cool configurations like this one, they also brought over spikers, underfolders, fixed stock wood, what have you. So, if the gun says made in China, you're fine. As far as the synthetic stockers, while the Claycos are most famous, other companies, for example, IAC, brought some over too. I believe that CSI did. And there was another couple small importers that did these either in the Bakelite red or black coloration. So it was not just Clayco that did these. Although again, they're the most famous and kind of cool for being early. And again, the name would switch from AKS to Type 56S. Just 56S for later versions of this. 56S2 for later versions of these. And they would come over up until 1989. So with that, let's get to our last batch of guns. And I've kind of saved what sometimes feels like the most common, although that's not to say anything bad about it, Preban configuration, the Type 56-1 or 56S-1, the underfolding stock variant. From the beginning, China made an underfolder, and it was very close to the original Russian pattern, but as they moved to the stamped receiver, they went to a kind of a unique pattern of stamped stock. Very heavy gauge stamping. You can see on both of these. But it retains kind of the original slant back with the angles to it receiver, unlike the AKMS stock. And also, just like the AKMS, it only locks on the left, like the original AKS, it only locks on the left side, whereas the AKMS, of course, locked on both sides. Another unique feature, this doesn't really have a true rear trunnion. You see, on your stamped receiver guns, there's actually a machined trunnion that's riveted in. Because this is a heavier receiver, they kind of have an end plate riveted in with two rivets very close together. Either way, the Chinese stock is just kind of its own unique thing. And it also has more of the downward sweep to it, like the original AKS versus the AKMS. Now the front ends were very similar to the rest. They could either take a Type 1 bayonet or Type 2, and slant brake or nut, either way. Now, one thing to point out, the military guns did not have the underfolding spike bayonet because it would interfere with the stock. But some of the civilian imports were what we call double underfolders. I don't have one to show you here. I never really was into them. They seemed a little cluttered to me, but you can find some that have both the underfolding stock and the spike bayonet. Now, both of these guns are Sile imports out of New York. And I don't know why, but in my life, I seem to come across more Sile AK type guns and with the underfolding stock than I do others. Who knows? It's kind of how it is. Now, this one up here is a true Preban. And this one down here is that interesting Caught in Customs gun. I've told the story before, but in brief, you know, in the late 80s, they were bringing over 56S-1s, and all was fine until March 8, 1989, when an executive order from George Bush banned the importation of assault rifles. Now, guns that were already in the country, like this one, were fine, and guns that were still in China could no longer come over with evil features. But what about guns that were technically on U.S. soil, but in bonded warehouses, or all the paperwork wasn't complete yet, or yada yada yada? Well, these are the so-called cotton customs guns. What they did was simply add a 1 to the name, so it was no longer the Preban name, and they would fold the stock up and basically pin it closed and attach a thumbhole stock very haphazardly. The front end they would tack weld on. You can see the remnants of the weld on this one, the nut, and they would very gently grind off the edges of the bayonet lug, versus this one where you see it's fully intact. Otherwise, they were unmolested, and they typically would still ship them with the 30-round mags, although later on they would get 10-rounders. I actually thought this gun was kind of cool when I saw it come out for auction years ago and picked it up. I think the cotton customs guns are just a unique piece of history. I believe there are some fixed stock cotton customs, and there may even be a couple of side-folding cotton customs guns, but I've never seen those in person. But these are the underfolders, and the underfolding gun was very popular within China in the military and for export, and again is a unique pattern, frankly. And if you're doing Preban guns, you'll probably run across these. Now, in the post-ban era, this video is not about those, but I should point out that you'll find some so-called slant cut receiver, MAC 90s or NHM 90, yada yada. And all of the MAC 90s with the milled receivers that came in 93 were slant cut. Those were actually originally receivers meant for underfolding stocks. That's the slant part. And I should mention, before someone says anything, yes, there were milled underfolders imported as well. And of course, all the guns that I've shown you today are in 7.62 by 39. And even with all of these, this is not even probably half of the variations brought over. But I did have several new ones, including this one to show you, so it seemed like a good time to revisit the Chinese AK. And here they are, flipped over. Here and again you can see the extended shelf safety on this one. See how it comes to the end. But on this one it has the non-extended shelf, kind of like we saw on the Legend. I just wanted to point that out. Little differences you'll find in Chinese AKs like that. In fact, it's hard to tell sometimes with these mag catches which one has the longer one. There are little differences though, and even in the pistol grips. So notice on the side it doesn't have the locking latch for the right because of the Chinese pattern. And again, some guns will have blue bolt carriers, especially the early underfolding imports. But on most of them you find do have the bolt carriers in the white. Just, again, different factories. I think it was typically factory 416 that did the blued ones. Most of your Polytech guns were factory 386. Yeah. And while most of your guns, except for the Legends, have the enclosed front sight base, there have been reports of some early imports with the open front sight base too. Again, little differences, which make collecting these a bunch of fun, frankly. So, let's wrap things up and have some final thoughts. I just felt like doing this video because I had a chance to show you quite a range of Chinese Prebans today, and one nearly Preban, mine. Some are mine, some belong to a friend. And these are not all. There were other 7.62 39 imports, for example, the Polytech so-called Galil side folder. It came in briefly with a longer length of pull Galil-esque side folding stock. There was also the 86S bullpup, quite a unique gun. It even had unique synthetic 20-round mags for it. I think they might have even been both hold open. I don't have it just because it's not really a military gun, although it's a little bit like the QBZ-95. There was also the 87S, which was a 20-inch barrel, often thought of as an RPK, although it was more like an RPD-esque thing. Again, it was mostly made for the export market and the U.S. market, and it was marketed as the national match sometimes. And there was the kind of very famous, infamous 88S. This wasn't a 7.62x39. This was a 5.45 gun, which was the very first 5.45 ever in the USA. Unfortunately, fewer than 100 came in, and they were exceedingly expensive because they just started to come in when the ban came down. And I've actually seen one in my life. Truth is, it was fine. It looked a lot like our gun up here. Just, it had an, well, sorry, this gun, but it had an AK-74 break and took different mags. But, you know, rarity. And that's not even getting into the 223, the 5.56 guns. Marketed as the 84S, that was a fixed stock. There was also an 84S-1 underfolder, and even an 84S-3, which was synthetic furniture. And I believe those were almost always in black, if not always in black versus the red. And there was another national match version known as the 56-5. I think you get the idea. Tons. Like I said, some were brought over in huge quantities, some just a few hundred. Some were exceedingly unique, like there was a Bakelite spiker. Those are pretty rare. Like, just a couple came over. So, if someone wants to collect them all, good luck. It gets expensive very quickly. For me, myself, and I'm pretty well content with my own collection of having the military-esque guns, because some were faithful semi-automatic versions of military select fire guns, while others were just kind of made for the U.S. market. And why not? We see the same thing today with the recent imports of other AK types. And these typically all came in just a cardboard box with 3 magazines, bayonet, sling, oiler, cleaning kit, and usually a handful of other small tools like a firing port scraper or sight tool or what have you. That could vary up a little bit. So, I don't know. This kind of felt like sharing with you today. Again, we're kind of doing a week of AKs, so Chinese AKs are a popular topic, and if you'd like to know more about the military history, I've covered that in the past, and I've gone into detail on individual guns in the past, including this Clayco as well. So to end with some personal thoughts. You know, we've done a few videos in the past on the Legend, and we had some mixed results with an earlier version. That wasn't this gun, but had some trouble. I really think for what these marketed for in the 80s, they were great guns. But I think if you're really talking about, is it a completely authentic Russian clone? No, it's not. And so that's why I've always been a little reluctant to pay the truly high dollar. On the other hand, there are not many milled AK imports. You've got the Valmets, if you want to call those AKs. The only reason I kind of hesitate is they're not parts interchangeable. And of course you've got the newer Arsenals. And you've got some recent guns out of WBP that are milled as well. But for a long time, these were the only milled AKs really available, and they were rightfully popular. To my mind, the spiker here, be it one of the Norinco or one of the Polytechs, is the coolest to me because this is as close to Vietnam era, maybe 70s era, Chinese PLA gun with the spike bayonet making up for it. Now, it's worth saying that when they went to the stamped receiver, they typically issued those to themselves, giving the older milled guns to allies like Albania, Vietnam, so on and so forth. So they seem to prefer the stamped guns. And then moving down to the 56S, this This is just a standard gun with a standard bayonet lug, otherwise very similar to this one up here. This is just kind of your Preban Chinese AK, and essentially in an export model configuration, as is this gun here, the Clayco. It's essentially the exact same gun, just with the synthetic furniture, frankly. And then, of course, as I talked about, our two underfolders. You know, China made underfolders, including some with the Bakelite furniture, for a very long time, and they were widely exported. And then finally, yeah, the 56-2 types. You can find some variations in pistol grip with these, and you can find different bayonet lugs. This one has the Type 1, that's the more common. A few have the Type 2 lug, the AKM. Those are pretty rare in the US. And there are minor differences between the Polytech pattern and the Norinco pattern. This is actually an earlier Norinco style, so I actually sought out a Norinco for my own reasons, because for once the Polytech versions are a little more common, frankly. But which one do you like? What's your favorite configuration? Maybe it's the Legend, maybe it's the Spiker, maybe you're a big fan of the folders, or yeah, maybe you like the simplicity, the wood of the IAC over here. Let me know what you think. Hope everyone's having a good week and all that stuff. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.